Welcome back, everyone. Today we are jumping headfirst into a really meaty part of the FIDIC Red Book 2017, Clause 12, all about measurement and valuation. Now, I know that sounds super technical and maybe a little dry, but I promise you we're going to break this down and make it as simple and exciting as possible, drawing from Michael D. Robinson's fantastic guide. Let's do this. So, just think about it for a second. How on earth do you count and pay for literally every single thing in a massive billion-dollar project? It seems impossible, right? Well, that is exactly the problem that Clause 12 is built to solve. To make sense of it all, let's imagine the whole thing is a giant high-stakes game. And in this game, Clause 12 is the official rulebook for keeping score.
All right, so in our construction game, you've got two main players. On one side, you have the contractor. They're the ones actually building everything. And on the other, you have the engineer, who's like the referee, making sure everything's done right for the client. The entire goal here is for both players to agree on the score as the game goes on, because that score directly decides how much money the contractor gets paid.
So how exactly do we keep score in this game? Well, it all starts with measurement. This is covered in the first couple of parts, subclauses 12.1 and 12.2. And really, this step is all about one thing: agreeing on the quantity of work that's been done. We're talking how many cubic meters of concrete were poured, how many tons of steel were installed. It's all about counting what's actually there on the ground.
The rulebook sets up two main ways of keeping score. First, you've got what are called interim measurements. Think of these as your monthly check-ins, right? They happen regularly to make sure the contractor gets paid and can keep the cash flowing. Then, at the very end of the project, you have the final measurement. This is the grand finale, the official, final tally of every single piece of work completed.
And this is where we get a little peek behind the curtain. The guide points out something really interesting. Even though the contract has this formal process, in the real world, it's almost always the contractor who's pushing the measurement process forward. And why? It's simple: cash flow. They need to count the work to get the invoices out and get paid. The engineer, in this scenario, plays the role of the referee, checking the contractor's work to make sure it's all accurate.
Okay, so what happens if the contractor thinks the referee, the engineer, made a bad call on a measurement? Well, the rules are very, very clear on this. First, the contractor has to issue a formal notice of disagreement. The engineer then takes another look. If they still don't agree, the contractor has to issue a second formal notice. And here is the absolutely critical part. They only have 14 days to do it. If they miss that deadline, that's it. The engineer's decision is final.
Now here's a fact that might actually surprise you, especially in international construction. Subclause 12.2 makes it clear that there is no single universal global standard for how to measure things. Wild, right? Instead, all the rules for how to measure are defined in a specific document for that project called the Bill of Quantities. That document becomes the ultimate guide, the Bible for that specific job. So, once we've counted all the points, we've agreed on the quantity, we get to the next really important phase: valuation. This is subclause 12.3. This is where we figure out what each of those points, each unit of work, is actually worth in cold hard cash.
Now, this is crucial. The prices that were in the original bid, they aren't always set in stone. The contract has specific rules for when a new price has to be figured out. This can happen if the work turns out to be totally different than expected, or if the quantity changes so much, we're talking more than 10%, that it messes with the cost per unit. Or, of course, if the work is part of a formal change order, which in FIDIC speak is called a variation.
So if we need a new price, but there's nothing similar in the contract to base it on, how do we calculate it? Well, the rulebook gives us a default formula. You figure out the actual cost of the work, that's all your materials, labor, equipment, the whole shebang, and then you add a fixed profit margin. And that magic number? It's 5%.
But what happens when the game itself changes right in the middle of play? This brings us to subclause 12.4, which is all about something called omissions. An omission is basically when the client decides to take a piece of the project out of the plan. Just imagine this. As the contractor, you've already gone out and bought a ton of special, custom-made materials for a specific part of the building. And then, out of the blue, the client cancels that part of the project. You'd be stuck with the bill. Well, this rule is a lifesaver. It allows the contractor to claim the cost they've already spent on work that gets canceled. It's really just a fairness rule, to make sure they don't lose money because of a change they had no control over.
Okay, you've followed the game, you've learned the rules of scoring, now let's see how much you've really soaked in. We've got a quick quiz before we wrap up with the final takeaways. You ready? Let's go!
Question number 1.
Thinking about how things work in the real world, who has the biggest reason, the biggest incentive to get all the work measured as fast as possible?
Question 2 is up. When we have to create a new price based on the actual cost of the work, what's that standard profit margin that the Red Book specifies?
And for our final question, if a contractor disagrees with a measurement from the engineer, what is the absolute, number one, very first thing they have to do according to the rules? All right, let's see how you did. The answer to question 1 is B, the contractor, because they're driven by cash flow. For question 2, it's also B, that all-important 5% profit margin. And for question 3, the correct first move is C, to give a formal notice. And these answers really hit on our key takeaways, right? Clause 12 is the rulebook for quantity and value. The contractor is usually in the driver's seat. Disagreements need a formal, fast notice. New prices often boil down to cost plus 5%, and finally, those omission rules are there to protect the contractor from losing out.
And that is our deep dive into FIDIC Clause 12. We really hope breaking it down this way was helpful for you. If it was, do us a favor and hit that like button. If you've got questions, or maybe you think we missed something, please let us know down in the comments. We read every single one.
Now, you might have noticed we kept mentioning the word variations today. And well, that's exactly where we're going next. Our very next explainer is going to tackle Clause 13, which is all about what happens when the actual scope of work changes. You are not going to want to miss that one, so make sure you follow and subscribe so you don't. We'll see you then.